In July 1894, a French daily paper, Le Petit Journal, organized a run from Paris to Rouen for horseless carriages. This was too early in the history of the cinema to find any film of the event, for it took place over a year before Lumière gave the French public their first film show in a Paris cafe. This fanciful reconstruction was made many years later and comes from the Daimler-Benz archive. The Paris-Rouen of 1894 was an ambitious project with over 100 entries, although only 21 got as far as the start. It was a great adventure for the competitors and the first chance for many of the public to see a motor car. The Paris-Rouen was not a race, but rather like the modern London to Brighton veteran car run, with plenty of unofficial rivalry. It has a special place in history for the humiliation of steam vehicles by the new petrol-engined cars. Only 4 steam vehicles finished, whereas all 13 petrol-driven cars arrived triumphantly. This film is fiction, but fortunately, an enterprising photographer recorded entrance at the stop for lunch. At de Dion's steam tractor was fastest by just 3 minutes, in spite of an excursion into a field of potatoes. But the Comte de Dion and Mouchot de Bouton did not qualify for the major award, as a mechanic was needed as well as a driver. The few other steam cars to finish were hours behind. Monsieur Roger de Montet did not finish, but had an honorable mention for his steam tricycle heated by petrol blow lamps. Monsieur Scott and his steam vehicle were awarded a consolation prize as the most deserving vehicle that failed to reach Rouen. Only 3.5 minutes behind the big steam de Dion tractor was the first of the petrol-engine cars, a Peugeot, with 8 more Peugeots and Panhards close behind. The cars were all French, but all had similar V-twin engines made by the Daimler Motor Company of Stuttgart, Germany. Just over an hour behind the Peugeots and the Panhards, and well ahead of the remaining steam vehicles, was Émile Roger, sitting proudly in the car that he'd entered as a Roger. But although the name was French, both the engine and the car had been built in Germany. The Roger was in fact a standard Benz Victoria, made by the Benz company of Mannheim in southern Germany. The single-cylinder Benz Victoria was reliable and comparatively cheap, and although it was slow, it was produced in hundreds and made Benz the biggest car manufacturer in the world. Carl Benz lived long enough to appear on film in one of his favorite cars, in this rare footage filmed at a celebration of veteran cars in Munich in 1925. Benz believed 20 miles an hour was fast enough for any motor vehicle, and that higher speeds would be dangerous. But not everyone shared his view. The French pioneer motorist, Émile Levasseur, had taken part in the Paris-Rouen with his own Panhard Levasseur, and was keen to race. Unlike other cars, his Panhard had the engine mounted at the front. Levasseur drove his unique car in a race from Paris to Bordeaux and back in 1895, in what is generally regarded as the world's first motor race. Daimler had provided Levasseur with the new, lighter and more powerful engine, the Phoenix, and the race was a triumph for Levasseur and for Daimler. It was one of the great drives in motoring history, and Levasseur drove the full 730 miles in just over 48 hours on rough roads with solid tires, and averaged 15 miles an hour. Motorsport had established the motor car as a practical and reasonably fast means of transport. But Daimler's own cars, like the Benz, were also reliable and slow. The belt-driven Riemenwagen had the more powerful Phoenix engines, but were not built for speed. Ignition was by the rather time-consuming hot tube ignition system. About 150 Daimler Riemenwagens were made, but they were little faster than the Benz. However, one Riemenwagen was sold in the south of France to a wealthy diplomat and businessman, Emil Jelinek. Jelinek was a keen cyclist, and although he found the Daimler slow, he was impressed by the engineering, and, seeing the potential, bought more and more cars, which he sold successfully amongst his many society friends and acquaintances. In 1899, he placed an order for 4 new cars, provided they were capable of 25 miles per hour. It was an order the company could not refuse. The Daimler Phoenix of 1899 was the most advanced car of its day, with a 4-cylinder inline engine at the front and electrical ignition. The Phoenix was more powerful and faster than any car the Daimler company had ever built before, and a proud Emil Jelinek was elected to the Daimler board of directors. Daimler was by now a very sick man, and this is one of the last photographs of the great pioneering engineer. Gottlieb Daimler died on the 6th of March, 1900. Wilhelm Maybach, Daimler's lifelong friend and partner, now had full technical responsibility and had to meet the orders of the ever-demanding Jelinek for faster and faster cars. Jelinek also insisted that these cars should be named after his young daughter, Mercedes. This 35-horsepower car of 1901 was the first Daimler car to be called a Mercedes. Count Zabrowski was one of Jelinek's first and most famous customers. The cinema and the motor car grew up together. By 1902, both were forms of popular entertainment in France. Few early films have survived, but these were found in remarkably good condition. It was a thrill when this enterprising cameraman took his camera aboard a motor car. But it is even more exciting to find included shots of one of the great races from city to city, the Paris-Vienna of 1902. In the few years since German cars and engines were supreme, speeds had risen dramatically, and French cars now led the world. Number 7 is a 70-horsepower Panhard driven by Henri Fabre. Number 5 is another great driver of the day, the Chevalier René Denif. These are the Panhards and Moors that won time after time, as cars raced across Europe at the turn of the century. French cars with French engines had taken over and dominated international motorsport. By 1903, Germany had a car to challenge the finest France could produce. The Mercedes 90 was more powerful than either the latest French 70-horsepower Panhards or the Moors. By April, a team was ready to represent Germany in the greatest international motor race of the time, the Gordon Bennett, which was to take place on the 2nd of July, 1903, in Ireland. Mercedes was selling well, and the Daimler works at Cannstatt, a suburb of Stuttgart, were bursting at the seams, with a new factory being built at another Stuttgart suburb, Untertürkheim. Then, with less than a month to go, disaster struck. All the new team cars were destroyed in a fire at the old Cannstatt factory. This was a crippling blow, but at the same time the company faced another very different problem. The German Motor Club would not accept the Daimler Works drivers were of high enough social status to represent Germany in such a great international event. The outlook was bleak, but a solution was found to both problems. Cars were lent by customers, and aristocratic drivers, regardless of nationality, were invited to drive. A Belgian, Baron Decatur, was considered of sufficient social status to represent Germany and drove one of the 3 borrowed Mercedes 60s. Another Belgian, Camille Janazzi, who described himself as an engineer by profession and a gentleman by choice, was also accepted by the German Motor Club. The 3rd Mercedes was driven by Foxhall Keane, an American who was wealthy enough to be accepted as a gentleman in Europe. An 80-horsepower British Napier led off, driven by last year's winner, SF Edge. 7 minutes later, an 80-horsepower French Panhard with René Denif followed. One of the low-slung American Wintons had 2 4-cylinder engines to give it a massive 17 litres. The 70-horsepower French Moors was streamlined to make it look like an upturned boat. Janazzi was 4th off in one of the smaller Mercedes. This historic event was filmed by Hepworth and other pioneer British filmmakers. This early film was described in Hepworth's contemporary catalogue. A fine stretch of road is seen, each car coming with terrific speed towards the camera and causing the spectators to hold their breath as the cars swing round a very sharp corner at the speed of an express train. The staggered starts should have kept these dangerous cars apart on the 90-mile circuit. But Janazzi drove so fast that on his first lap, he caught up with a Winton that had started 7 minutes earlier, and then lost several minutes before he could pass. The 327-mile race lasted over 6.5 hours, and the borrowed cars proved as fast as the specially built racing machines. Horns were important equipment, but it is doubtful if they did much to help on the narrow Irish roads. From the second lap, Janazzi held the lead for the remaining 200-odd miles and won by just over 10 minutes. This was the first ever international win for both Mercedes and for Germany. Camille Janazzi had won his place among the great drivers of motor racing history, and a leading French writer considered that Germany has proved that she is technically at the top in the automobile movement. Three new Mercedes 90s were prepared at the new Untertürkheim factory for the 1904 Gordon Bennett, which was to be held in Germany. Jelinek, now a director on the board of Daimler, personally arranged, somewhat deviously, for an extra team of Mercedes to take part as an Austrian entry. He was taking no chances. A confident and triumphant Germany made the 1904 Gordon Bennett a general holiday, and even the Kaiser was up early for the 7 o'clock start. Janazzi led off for Germany in a Mercedes, and Edge followed for Britain in a Napier. 19 cars started, and Janazzi was first to reappear. But to the horror of the vast crowd, Thierry's French Richard Brazier was fastest and led from start to finish. Léon Thierry was a professional driver and a competent mechanic, and many deplored the rise of paid drivers and saw this as the end of motor racing as a true sport. The 87-mile circuit was in the fashionable Taunus area and included several towns and villages. 7.5 miles were neutralized, and cars were paced by cyclists through the restricted areas. But the new Mercedes 90s did not handle as well as the smaller 60s, And it was noticeable that the winning French car, the Richard Brazier, had shock absorbers and ran more smoothly than the other cars. The race was humiliating for Germany when Genozzi was over 11 minutes behind, when Thierry won for France. Race organization was modest when the first ever important American road race, the Vanderbilt Cup, was held in October 1904. Mercedes took part, but French cars again dominated. A new Works 90 from Stuttgart was one of 5 Mercedes that failed to finish, and the race was won by Heath on a 70-horsepower panel. The magnificent new Daimler factory at Untertürkheim was now in production, and the number of employees went up from around 800 in 1903 to over 3,000 in 1905. But Mercedes racing suffered as production trebled and included a wide variety of smaller and less powerful cars, like this Mercedes 1822. An unhappy Maybach is sitting in the passenger seat. Maybach suffers from old age, claims Jelinek, who is now calling himself Mr. Mercedes Jelinek. This is one of the last pictures of Maybach, the great engineer-designer, before he is pushed aside. France was again on top in motor racing, and in 1906, the French Automobile Club drew up regulations for a race to replace the Gordon Bennett. The French Grand Prix no longer limited entries to a few teams from national clubs and accepted entries from 9 different French firms and 3 German and Italian companies. Three Mercedes were up against 29 other cars. Well-intentioned regulations were intended to make cars slower and safer by limiting the weight to around 1 ton. But these fragile cars still had large engines and were as fast and dangerous as ever. It was another bad day for Mercedes. Only 2 Mercedes finished and were 10th and 11th. A French Renault won by over half an hour. Early in 1907, Germany had its Grand Prix, the Kaiser Prize. The 92 cars entered were officially touring cars, but with a weight limit of little more than 1 ton, were different from other racing cars of the time. The race was another disaster for Germany, with Salzer's Mercedes in 9th place. An Italian Fiat was first, driven by Felice Nazzaro. He had been a Fiat apprentice and proved a brilliant, elegant driver who could be seen driving the toughest races in a lounge suit. Mr. Mercedes Jelinek declared that, "I alone am capable of saving the whole thing, but I would do this only if I had again absolute power in Untertürkheim, not otherwise." The 1907 French Grand Prix limited the amount of fuel used, but this had little effect on the type of cars used. Three Mercedes were entering, and only one, driven by Emery, was running at the end, in 10th place. Italian Fiats won the 3 major races of 1907, and the new star was Felice Nazzaro. Paul Daimler, Gottlieb's eldest son, became head of design and technical director of Daimler when the sick and unhappy Maybach finally resigned. Paul Daimler's 1908 racing Mercedes was the ultimate refinement of the classic chain-driven racing car. The bodywork had been swept up to waist level to give the drivers some protection, even though the weight limit remained much the same. The organizers also wanted to stop engines getting bigger and bigger, with restrictions on engine size. And Paul Daimler designed a new 120 horsepower four-cylinder engine. 3 of these cars were sent to Dieppe for the 1908 French Grand Prix. Gentlemen amateur drivers were on their way out, and the 3 drivers were all Daimler employees. A newcomer to racing was the almost unknown works tester Christian Lautenschlager, although he'd worked for the company since 1899. Benz was also meeting the challenge with a formidable new car, the 1908 Grand Prix Benz. Benz lacked Daimler's racing experience, but a team of expatriate engineers designed a 150 horsepower car with a remarkably smooth 12-litre overhead valve engine. The leading Benz driver was the colorful Victor Emery. Emery was one of the fastest drivers of the day, but had an unfortunate reputation for fighting both the press and officials. On the great day, the starter borrowed some matches, and the 1908 Grand Prix was underway. A dozen cars were still waiting to start when the first car arrived. It was Pogue's Mercedes. 48 cars started, and 20 were timed at over 100 miles per hour. 1.5 tons of car with thin, fragile tires on terrible roads and almost no brakes. Salzer led in his Mercedes on the first lap, but retired soon afterwards. Then Nazaro took the lead, only to break the crankshaft. On lap 4, after 2.5 hours, Emery in his Benz was leading by barely 2 minutes when he arrived at the Hermann alongside a slower French car. Their superhuman mechanics got the vast engine started, and Emery only dropped to second. The lead was taken by the almost unknown newcomer, Christian Lautenschlager. At the finish, there were no tires left in the Mercedes pits. Lautenschlager was lucky as well as highly skilled. Equally impressive were the Benz, which came in second and third and won the team prize. The day was an overwhelming victory for Germany. This was not the result the French wanted, and there was not another French Grand Prix for several years. Motor racing enthusiasm was growing fast in America. And the German cars added to their triumph when a version of the Grand Prix Benz was fitted with an even larger engine to become a legend. The fastest ever traveled by a human being, no greater speed having been recorded except that made by a bullet. Kaiser Wilhelm wrote to Barney Oldfield to say, "I congratulate a daring Yankee on so remarkable a performance on a German car." The Blitzen Benz was barnstormed around America by Oldfield and Wild Bob Berman, breaking track record after track record. In 1911, the new Indianapolis Speedway held its first 500-mile sweepstake. and among the front runners was Spencer Wishart, who had been given a Mercedes 140 for his 21st birthday. After 3 laps, the Mercedes took the lead and held it for the next 8. The race was full of incident. An American Marmon won this first 500. But European cars were to take a dominant part in American racing for many years. The French Grand Prix collapsed after the German triumph in 1908. But on the day before that humiliating race, the first Voiturette Grand Prix had been a triumph for French cars. Varying limitations on engine and weight made Voiturette racing a technical challenge, as well as an exciting sport. And the cars cost a lot less than the expensive Grand Prix versions of the day. The 1908 Voiturette Grand Prix had been won by the burly, cheerful Albert Guillot in a single-cylinder Delage. Voiturette racing flourished in the following years, and Peugeot returned to racing. After a lapse of 4 years, the French Grand Prix was back in 1912 and had lost none of its appeal. A French film company used the event to make the inevitable idiotic film. But the race itself was just as dramatic. Fiat had entered a team of 14-litre chain-driven giants of the old school, and the new school was represented by 3 untried Peugeots of half the engine size and driven by Voiturette drivers. The final result was close, but Peugeot was first, and its driver, Georges Boileau, became a national hero. The 1913 French Grand Prix had weight and fuel regulations that effectively ruled out the giants, and the race was a close battle between the new breed of smaller, high-performance cars. Only a few weeks earlier, Peugeot had won the 500 at Indianapolis. The Peugeots, with twin overhead camshafts, were the most advanced cars of their day, but there was close competition from the new Delages and British Sunbeams. A team of Mercedes was refused because the cars had been entered by a Belgian and not the manufacturer. Boileau won again for Peugeot. France was back at the top of the motor racing world. The minor Grand Prix of France at Le Mans accepted Pilet's team of Mercedes. All had chain drive, and 3, with aggressive pointed radiators, had modified aero engines. All 4 were much bigger than the Delage. Peugeot could afford to ignore this minor race, and the honor of France rested on Delage. Paul Bableau lapped at over 82 miles an hour, and Delage led from start to finish. Bableau won by over 3 minutes, with another Delage second. Louis Delage had arrived on the Grand Prix scene and bought himself a fine house. The lessons of Le Mans were put to devastating effect in 1914. The factory entered 5 new 4-cylinder cars. Engine size was limited to 4.5 litres, and Daimler had never built such small engines for racing before. For the first time in a Grand Prix, the cars were started in pairs at 30-second intervals, for there were 36 cars and a dozen different makes. The Mercedes were up against a team of marvelous twin-cam Peugeots, and Peugeot had already set new standards for speed and road home. The crowd had come expecting an almost certain French victory, but enthusiasm gave way to consternation when a Mercedes came round in first place. This did not last, and by lap 6, Boileau was in the lead. But Rautenschlager was now close behind him and closing up, After 18 laps with only 2 to go, Lautenschlager at last took the lead. On the very last lap, Boileau's engine broke. The race was an overwhelming win for Daimler, with Mercedes first, second, and third. There were festivities at Untertürkheim, but there will be little to celebrate in the years ahead. A month after the Mercedes triumph, Germany was at war with France and Britain. When war was declared, one of the winning Mercedes was trapped in England as a prisoner of war, as it had been sent for display at the Milnes Daimler showroom in London's Shaftesbury Avenue. The engine was sent to Rolls-Royce to be examined, and W.O. Bentley pointed out that it was common knowledge that all Rolls-Royce aero engines built during the war were based quite closely on this engine. It is said that at the height of the war, Daimler sent a demand for a royalty payment. There was a last win for a 1914 Grand Prix Mercedes at Indianapolis in 1915. The only film we have of this historic event is of the parade lap before the race, which was won by Ralph de Palma. It will be 8 long years before these two great makes meet again. From the earliest days, the Targa Florio had been one of the toughest of all motor races. The rough mountain roads of Sicily, with their perilous corners, climb from the foot of the hills up to 3,000 feet to the village of Polizzi. Before the First World War, Italian and French cars had dominated the races, and Daimler, Benz, and Mercedes had all taken part with little success. Nevertheless, this classic race was to be the dramatic setting for the return of Germany to international motor racing after the First World War. A fragment of film shot in 1922 caught the Mercedes team in Rome on their way to Sicily. German teams had been banned by the French from the Grand Prix, and this was the first major race for Mercedes for many years. The 1922 Targa Florio also has a place in history for the first appearance in a race of supercharged Mercedes. But these were defeated by a privately owned, unsupercharged 1914 Grand Prix Mercedes driven by the dashing Count Mazzetti. The 1924 Targa Florio had 3 improved supercharged Mercedes. Ferdinand Porsche had left Austro-Daimler and taken over as chief engineer, and brought with him a promising young driver, Alfred Neubauer. Mercedes faced formidable competition. Even little-known cars like the Steiger had alloy engines and overhead camshafts, and Fiat, Peugeot, Ballot, and Alfa Romeo had all entered works cars. Mazzetti, with an Alfa Romeo, led on the first lap, with a huge 8-liter Hispano-Suiza only 13 seconds behind on time. Such a close fight had never been seen before in the Targa Florio. Within the same minute were Boileau's Peugeot, Ascari's Alfa, and Werner on the leading Mercedes. Neubauer is one of the team, and his Mercedes, like the others, has been painted red to confuse local brigands who might have thrown stones and rocks at a white German car. Dr. Ferdinand Porsche had already improved the performance of the racing Mercedes, and all were supercharged. The extra power on the rough roads increased tire wear, and the works insisted that new tires were fitted at a midway stop. Pit scenes were informal and dramatic in the Targa Florio. Time was not wasted switching off, even when refueling with red-painted open churns. Official and unofficial assistants all joined in with enthusiasm. If there was a rule limiting the number of helpers, It could never have been applied, or everyone would have been disqualified. The result was in doubt right to the end, and after 6.5 hours, less than 30 minutes separated the first 10 cars. It was a triumph for the quiet, reserved Christian Werner, who won by less than 10 minutes. Mercedes were back and winning. Porsche had made full use of Daimler-Benz wartime experience in supercharging aircraft to build a Mercedes worthy of the name. Benz used their wartime experience with aircraft and aerodynamics to produce the rear-engined Tropfenwagen. They bristled with new ideas, but never went into commercial production. The only film of these advanced, streamlined cars in the Daimler-Benz archive is taken at various celebrations. They were built when Daimler and Benz were working towards a merger in order to survive, and there was not enough money to develop such a new and advanced design. In spite of the depressed economy, the German Grand Prix in 1926 and the Berlin Aarhus was an international event, with drivers from France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and Czechoslovakia. But the white Mercedes was a new supercharged 8-cylinder racing car designed by Porsche. 2 Mercedes were run, in theory, by amateurs in cars lent by the works. One was lent to Adolf Rosenberg, already an experienced driver, and the second to Rudolf Caracciola, a Mercedes salesman. The 46 cars were sent off in groups at 2-minute intervals, with the biggest cars first. As the flag fell for the 2-leader group, Caracciola started well and then stalled. With a superhuman effort, the mechanic, Salsa, began pushing, but they were by then well down the field. Rosenberg had taken the lead and was well ahead when it began to rain. The road became as slippery as if covered in soap, and Rosenberg was still leading the race when he lost control and crashed into a timekeeper's hut. 2 students were killed instantly, and a 3rd man died later. The Porsche 8 had gained a reputation as a killer. The nightmare race continued with further accidents, and Caracciola's situation became more hopeless than ever when he lost more time with plug trouble. When the race ended, it was an astonished Caracciola who found that he had won. This was the first evidence of the almost uncanny ability of Caracciola to shine under appalling conditions, which was to lead to his reputation as the Rainmaster. This was also an auspicious start for the merger of Daimler and Benz, which had taken place barely a fortnight before the Grand Prix. On the 18th of June, 1927, the Nürburgring was opened. This chaotic archive film gives some idea of the racing circuit, built as a community project to ease unemployment during the German slump. The first meeting was a variety of short races, and parts of the circuit were still unfinished. The Nürburgring was to be the setting for many great Mercedes victories, and where Rudi Caracciola was to win some of his greatest races. The Mercedes-Benz company was concentrating its limited resources on building a few expensive sports cars that could be sold to wealthy drivers and would bring prestige to their more numerous, cheaper cars. These exciting cars, like Bugattis, were bought by many private owners and kept the name of Mercedes and that of the newly formed company, Daimler-Benz, to the fore in these difficult years. Sports car racing flourished as Grand Prix racing declined. The 1929 Belfast Tourist Trophy had 72 entries, as millionaires in Bentleys and Mercedes raced alongside privately owned Ford touring cars. There were 8 Alfa Romeos, 6 Bugattis, 3 supercharged Birkin Bentleys, and 2 Works Mercedes. The circuit was just under 14 miles, and although Caracciola came through first, he was no better than 48th on handicap after the first hour. Campari and the other Alfa Romeos were taking full advantage of their two-lap start. Caracciola was out to prove that the supercharged Mercedes was the fastest sports car in the world. But with 5 Bentleys pressing hard, the result was always in doubt. Competition between the big cars was almost too close at times. A wealthy British amateur, Scrap Thistlethwaite, was 3rd fastest overall and 14th on handicap when he was slowed with plug trouble. Then it rained, and the baby Austins became favourites with their 5-lap start, as the rain could be expected to put the larger cars at an even greater disadvantage. Otto Mertz, in the second works Mercedes, damaged a wing, removed it, and was disqualified. But Caracciola was in his element, and with 2 laps to go, took the lead from Campari, and at the finish was surprised to find he had won by 2 minutes. It was a triumph for the hard-pressed German motor industry and for their brightest star. But only 2 months later, the Wall Street stock market crashed, and there would be no more money for any works Mercedes or to pay drivers. In May 1932, the fastest motor race in the world was the Arbersrennen in Berlin. The year before, Caracciola had averaged over 115 miles an hour to win in a Mercedes. But in 1932, the almost unthinkable happened, and Caracciola was driving an Italian Alfa Romeo, specially painted white. A wealthy German aristocrat, Manfred von Brauchitsch, had one of only 2 privately entered Mercedes. Malcolm Campbell, the world land speed record holder, brought over his famous Brooklands car, the Sunbeam Tiger. There were some of the fastest Bugattis, and they soon took the lead. But the high speeds took their toll, and the race became a duel between von Brauchitsch's specially streamlined Mercedes and Caracciola's Alfa Romeo. Caracciola had reached 130 miles an hour in 1931 in a 7-litre SSKL Mercedes. But the similarly streamlined car was timed at a dramatic 143 miles an hour. The race became an epic battle between the 2 white cars, and one of the last for the giant Mercedes. New regulations to reduce such speeds would limit the weight in 1934. The battle continued right to the end, when von Brauchitsch won by 4 seconds, after averaging 120 miles an hour for 183 miles. The last great win for an SSKL Mercedes, and the first big win for a new German star, Manfred von Brauchitsch.
Beinahe hätte mich Caracciola doch noch nicht vorgelassen. Gott sei Dank, dass ich es geschafft habe. Ich freue mich schrecklich. Mein erster großer Sieg.
In 1934, the weight of Grand Prix cars was limited to 750 kilograms. And on the 3rd of June, on the Nürburgring, 2 new Mercedes and 3 new Auto Unions met the latest Alfa Romeos, straight-8 Maseratis, and Bugattis. The 2 Mercedes immediately went into the lead. The experienced Luigi Fagioli was driving for Mercedes and took the lead from von Brauchitsch. The Italian and French cars were outclassed. Only Stuck with his Auto Union was anywhere near the Mercedes. Von Brauchitsch was on his own in first place, after a disgruntled Fagioli had been told to give way and had retired. Stuck in his Auto Union came up into an unexpected 2nd place. It was an easy win for the new W25 Mercedes on its first appearance, and for von Brauchitsch as a works driver. The French Grand Prix at Montlhéry on the outskirts of Paris was to be held on the 1st of July. This was to be one of the most important motor races ever. It was more than a sporting event, it was also a political challenge. Hitler had just become the supreme commander in Germany and claimed that the new formula must be a measuring stick for German knowledge and ability. No expense had been spared, and both Mercedes and Auto Union teams had been given state subsidies. One of Hitler's old cronies, Corps Führer Adolf Hunlein, had been put in charge of all German motorsport. This Nazi thug will become a familiar figure at all important races. Fagioli wondered how he got hold of such fine binoculars. Daimler-Benz was there in force, and Alfred Neubauer had given up driving to organize the Mercedes team on a scale never seen before. All seemed set for a great German triumph. The Mercedes literally just scraped under a new weight limit when the white paint was stripped off to bare aluminium, and as a result they became known as the Silver Arrows. Caracciola was back after an horrific crash when driving an Alfa and will limp for the rest of his life. Von Brauchitsch was the favorite, and the experienced but erratic driver Fagioli made up the team. By the time the flag fell, Chiron had come through from the third row to take the lead in an Alfa Romeo. The German cars were impressively fast, but as the race wore on, the Mercedes and Auto Unions fell by the wayside. It's ironic that almost the only film of the 1934 Mercedes in the German archive was shot on this day of calamities. Brakes, tires and gearboxes all gave trouble, and all the German cars were out long before the end. All the same, these were formidable cars, and in the months ahead went on to win race after race. The French Grand Prix came to an end with Alfa Romeos first, second, and third. In 1934, Mercedes won 4 Grand Prix races out of 8. Many saw it as a triumph for a new Germany. But it was a pity that the driver of the year was an Italian, Luigi Fagioli. The 1935 season started off with the Monaco Grand Prix and 3 Mercedes on the front row. Fagioli led from the start. The Auto Unions were not ready, and Von Brauchitsch managed only 1 lap. All 3 Mercedes drivers had broken the lap record in practice, and the improved Alfas and Maseratis were impressive. Fagioli was in great form, and by half distance was leading by nearly a minute. Four Alfas had been entered by Ferrari, and after Caracciola retired his Mercedes with a broken valve, Alfas took 2nd and 3rd place. Fagioli had an easy win for Mercedes. The French Grand Prix was in June. Auto Union were now ready, and 3 chicanes reduced the speed at dangerous points, but these did not stop the German cars. Unfortunately, both Auto Unions retired with engine trouble, and although Nuvolari led for a short time in a Ferrari Alfa, Caracciola and Von Brauchitsch lapped the field and came in an easy 1st and 2nd. The defeat of 1934 had been fully avenged, and Mercedes were on top of the world. The German Grand Prix, however, was a dramatic surprise. Mercedes had 5 cars, and there were 4 auto unions. The brilliant young Rosemeyer, as well as Fazzi and Stuck, competing for the Adolf Hitler Prize. Early on, Caracciola burst through to take his expected lead. But Nuvolari was not far behind and drove the race of his lifetime. On the last lap, von Brauchitsch, who had taken over the lead, burst a tire, and it was Nuvolari who carried off the Adolf Hitler Prize by just over 1 minute.
Großer Preis von Tripolis, Sieger Caracciola auf Mercedes-Benz.
1935 had been a great year for the Silver Arrows and was celebrated in this short film.
Caracciola gewinnt das Nürburgrennen.
Mercedes won 9 out of the 11 major races, and Auto Union had 1 first and 3 second places. Auto Union had shown their potential with Stuck, Fazzi, and a newcomer, Rosemeyer. And Caracciola had returned to his triumphant form with 6 wins. Caracciola led Nuvolari off the grid when the 1936 season started on a wet day in Monte Carlo. The cars were shorter, lighter, and more powerful. And Louis Chiron, after his dazzling performance in France, had been recruited to make the team more international. The leading Mercedes and the Alfa Romeo were well ahead when an unwitting back marker sprayed oil on the wet track. Chiron's Mercedes hit the oil and he was out, together with von Brauchitsch. Nuvolari retired with brake failure, and Caracciola took the lead with a superb drive to win. On what proved to be a dismal year, the Monaco Grand Prix was almost the only win for Mercedes and for Caracciola. The Eiffel Grand Prix in June on the Nürburgring confirmed that all was not well with the new Mercedes. Caracciola led soon after the start, but Nuvolari passed him to take the lead on the 3rd lap. The auto unions proved unequal in road holding to the latest Mercedes. Then, as vast fog clouds rolled down off the Eiffel Mountains, the newcomer, Bernd Rosemeyer, lapped at over 40 seconds a lap faster than any of the finest drivers in the world. A new champion had arrived. Bernd Rosemeyer went on to win 5 Grand Prix races in 1936. The 1936 Mercedes looked lovely, but was a failure. Its bad handling made it very difficult to drive. Understandably, there's little film of that unhappy year in the Daimler-Benz archive. However, help was on the way. A young engineer, Rudolf with a German father and an English mother, had been transferred from passenger to the racing service and was to transform the racing Mercedes. The 1937 Grand Prix season opened in North Africa. Mussolini had recently proclaimed his fascist empire, and Tripoli was to be his showplace, with a very fast race circuit and buildings to rival the German Nürburgring. The Tripoli Grand Prix was the fastest motor race in the world, and a state lottery made it the richest. 5 Mercedes and 5 auto unions streaked ahead of all the Italian cars. The new W125 Mercedes not only had more power, but the great improvements in the chassis had transformed the handling. Korpsführer Adolf Huhnlein was there to see that the German cars defeated the Italians. A newcomer, Hermann drove superbly to average over 134 miles an hour. This was the first major win for the ex-racing mechanic, and few wins have ever been more popular with the men on the ground. Mercedes and Auto Union had the first 8 places. It was an overwhelming victory for Germany. Three weeks later, there was a race in the German capital, Berlin, with a crowd of 380,000. The already fast Alfred circuit had been modified with a wall of death to make it even faster than Tripoli. No expense was spared, and both Mercedes and Auto Union had developed specially streamlined cars capable of speeds of around 240 miles an hour. This was one of the very few occasions when Mercedes carried swastikas. Alfa Romeo had discreetly withdrawn. There were 3 heats and a final, and the Mercedes, with new, more powerful engines, won all 3. Goebbels was there to witness the return of Mercedes. Lang won the final at an average speed of over 162 miles an hour, and was presented with his garland by no less than the Nazi sports chief himself, Adolf Hunlein. Having won the first 2 races, Mercedes lost the next 3. Auto Union had a brilliant driver in Rosemeyer, and he made full use of the powerful, unconventional cars on the Nürburgring. The Mercedes had fuel pump troubles, and no one could catch the flying Rosemeyer, who won the Eiffel Grand Prix at a record speed. Rosemeyer and Caracciola were together on board the luxury liner Bremen when the German teams went to New York for the Vanderbilt Cup. Von Brauchitsch and Lang stayed behind to take part in the Belgian Grand Prix. Rosemeyer catapulted away in the lead. Dick Seaman took over the lead when Rosemeyer's engine spluttered, only to lose it when he too had trouble. The Vanderbilt Cup was another win for Rosemeyer and Auto Union. The tourists were not back in time for the Belgian Grand Prix, and von Brauchitsch, Lang, and a Swiss driver, Christian Kautz, raced against a second team of Auto Unions. Mercedes had mechanical problems, and Kautz slid off the road. An Auto Union came in first, and a surprised and shaken Rudolf had his one and only Grand Prix win. By 1937, the German Grand Prix had become the most important race of the year. Lang, von Brauchitsch and Rosemeyer fought for the lead as the Mercedes and auto unions drew away from the 17 Italian cars. By the end of the first lap, Lang was in the lead in a titanic battle with Rosemeyer, von Brauchitsch and Caracciola. Rosemeyer led for 3 laps, but hit a bank and damaged a wheel and tyre, and dropped to 10th. By the 4th lap, the Mercedes W125s were 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th. Nuvolari in one of Ferrari's Alfa Romeos had less power, but his superb driving brought him up to an impressive 3rd. Uhlenhaut's W125 had Mercedes back among the winners. Towards the finish, Caracciola was 1st, von Brauchitsch 2nd, and the incredible Rosemeyer had clawed his way back to 3rd. Caracciola had his first win of the year. Monaco was another epic battle, although Lang and Seaman were away ill. Hasse added to the fun by coming out of the tunnel backwards. On lap 19, Rosemeyer crashed, trying to pass von Brauchitsch, who was lying 2nd. Caracciola was leading and could now relax, as a Mercedes win seemed certain. But von Brauchitsch saw this as his chance, and in spite of signals to slow down, a furious battle developed. This was not the way Neubauer liked to manage his team. Caracciola put in a fantastic record lap that was not broken for 18 years, but damaged his engine and finished 2nd. Von Brauchitsch finally won by half a lap. Three Mercedes were sent to Pescara for the Caracciola, with 4 auto unions to meet an Italian challenge in the shape of Nuvolari in a new, lower, more powerful V12 Alfa Romeo. In a race full of incidents, Rosemeyer took the lead, only to lose it when a tire disintegrated. But Caracciola also had trouble. An auto union won 3 races in a row. In Switzerland, Neubauer had everything under control, even the photographers. Rosemeyer lost time with brake trouble, and Caracciola and Lang had it all their own way. Mercedes came home first, second, and third. The Italians moved their Grand Prix in September from the fast Monza circuit to the narrow streets of Livorno. But brick walls and concrete blocks did little enough to slow the German cars. Only Nuvolari got among the leaders. Caracciola won again, with Lang second and Rosemeyer in third place. The Czech Grand Prix was on even more dangerous roads. Nuvolari, driving with one tire missing, still kept up among the Germans. It was a dramatic race. Lang crashed, and sadly, 2 spectators were killed. Rosemeyer also crashed, but ran back on foot cross-country to the pits and took over Muller's car. This was to be Nuvolari's last drive for Alfred, and he could not get in front of the German cars. It was exciting up to the last lap, with Rosemeyer getting right back up to third place as Caracciola won again. The last race for the big supercharged Mercedes and auto unions was in the quiet English countryside. The Donington Grand Prix was in October, and the spectators had never seen, heard, or even smelt anything like it as the cars reached 170 miles an hour and leapt in the air as they passed the grandstand. Grand Prix racing had really come to Britain at last. It was a fitting swan song to a great motor racing year, and a last win for one of the motor racing greats of all time, Bernd Rosemeyer. Rosemeyer was killed that winter in a record attempt in Germany. (1938) was the dawn of a new era in Grand Prix racing, with a formula that drastically reduced engine capacity. Many expected speeds to drop, but Neubauer now had an unrivaled racing service that would make Grand Prix racing as dramatic as ever. 220 men, including 2 teams of 25 racing mechanics, were devoted entirely to the development and servicing of Mercedes racing cars. The experimental department did not manufacture any of the components, but absolute priority was given to racing requirements. No expense was spared. The new Mercedes made a modest first public appearance when, in April, 2 cars were transported to the south of France for a minor Grand Prix in the picturesque old town of Pau. For Mercedes, this was an anticlimax. Lang had trouble in practice, and his car was withdrawn. Caracciola was on his own in the front row, alongside an unsupercharged French Delahaye. The supercharged car was expected to romp away from the unsupercharged cars, but it didn't. Auto Union were not ready yet. Unsupercharged cars, like the Delahayes, had slightly larger engines and had the advantage of using less fuel. But on the 7th lap, the Mercedes was overtaken by the Delahaye, and the Mercedes had to stop to refuel. The French car romped home and was first by nearly 2 minutes, driven by René Dreyfus. The new Mercedes did not appear again until early in May, when a team was shipped from Europe to North Africa for the Tripoli Grand Prix. The new formula limited the supercharged engines to 3 litres, and the cars were heavier with a minimum weight. The new restrictions were designed to make the cars safer and to reduce the speeds. The new 3-litre Auto Unions were not yet ready. It was no small feat shipping a Daimler-Benz racing team by boat, but no expense was spared. Hitler was out to establish his idea of closer relations with Mussolini, and the British Prime Minister had just completed a pact with Italy. Motor racing was becoming more and more political, and Tripoli was more important than ever as the showplace for the growing Italian empire. Uhlenhaut faced all the problems of a new, almost untried design, and the African sun thinned the oil, and the heat made fuel consumption a greater problem than ever. Drivers are not always reliable guides to a car's performance, but Uhlenhaut had the advantage of Lang driving one of the cars. Lang was an experienced racing mechanic and was to play an important part in the development of the 3-litre Mercedes. Seaman had been brought along as a frustrated reserve. In spite of the new Maseratis, Alfa Romeos, and the hideous but effective Delahaye's, the Mercedes shot into the lead from the start. The new cars were extremely thirsty, with only 1 or 2 miles for each gallon of special fuel. Lang was the most economical with the fuel and went into the lead when Brauchitsch made an earlier stop. Each W154 carried over 100 gallons, and rapid refueling was essential. Lang suffered badly with the very corrosive special fuel. A washdown from a resourceful mechanic did little to help, as the fuel attacks the skin. But Lang had a 3-minute lead and drove on to lap the field and to win by 5 minutes. The new cars were almost as fast as the old, and Lang averaged over 127 miles an hour to win. Mercedes were first, second, and third. For 2 years, the French Grand Prix had been a sports car race, but in July 1938, it was moved to a fast circuit near Reims, and Mercedes and Auto Union had entered 3 cars each. Seaman described the race as quite one of the stupidest ever. 3 Mercedes sailed ahead, and neither of 2 auto unions finished a lap. 2 had crashed in practice. The French cars were soon laps behind the Mercedes, which played round together. This ridiculous race was also marred by crowds of Nazis, the football hooligans of the 30s, who had come over to glory in humiliating the French. The German Grand Prix was to be a very different affair. Practice was as dramatic as the race, because the all-important positions on the starting grid were based on lap times. The finest cars and drivers of the day were competing against each other on the greatest racing circuit in the world. The full Nürburgring was over 14 miles long, with a road that swooped up and down the hills and valleys of the Eifel Mountains, with 174 different corners. It was a supreme test of both skill and courage. This was where legends were made, and the Nazi sports chief, Korpsführer Hünlein, was out to make political capital for the Third Reich. Hünlein made certain that Nuvolare gave the right silly salute. Von Brauchitsch drove brilliantly to take pole position and was declared an NSKK Sturmführer. Obersturmführer Lang was second, and a modest Mr. Seaman was third. Caracciola was fourth, and Nuvolare, now driving an auto union, was alongside. 3 other new auto unions were also near the front. But not everything went according to plan. The start was sensational when the starting lights did not work. But Lang had his eyes on Neubauer, and he blistered away into the lead. Bursting out of the south curve, the order was Lang, Nuvolare, Seaman, Caracciola, Hasse, and Brauchitsch. It became Lang, Seaman, Caracciola when Nuvolare left the road backwards. Lang had plug trouble, and Seaman took the lead. It was almost unthinkable that an Englishman should be in the lead in a German Grand Prix. Seaman was driving superbly and drove the fastest lap of the day. But when he came in for tyres, von Brauchitsch took the lead, with Seaman following respectfully in second place. When von Brauchitsch came in for his last pit stop, Seaman was close behind. Seaman was waiting to start when von Brauchitsch's car caught fire. Seaman called to his mechanics to start the engine and rejoined the race in first place. With 6 laps to go, Seaman had a lead of over 2 minutes over the next Mercedes and Auto Unions. Meanwhile, to Neubauer's disgust, Kuhnlein ordered von Brauchitsch to get back in his car and continue racing. Not long after, von Brauchitsch was back in the pits, but without a car on his steering wheel. Seaman drove on like a dream, and the German crowd showed their sporting appreciation of his great drive. The first time an Englishman had won a Grand Prix since 1924. An embarrassed Kuhnlein explained to the crowd and Herr Hitler that the virtual winner was a German, Sturmführer von Brauchitsch. Italy was the motor racing country between the wars, with dozens of races in many different parts of the country. The Montenero circuit at Livorno was one of the most popular. And in 1938, the Mercedes team took time off between Grand Prix races for 2 Italian races. Nuvolari had won here 5 times, and it was a showplace for Italian cars, with Count Trossi in a 3-liter Maserati and Farina in a 12-cylinder Alfa Romeo that matched the speed of the Mercedes. It was a tough circuit and a tough race with many failures. Von Brauchitsch was disqualified for receiving unwanted assistance, and Lang won again, with Farina second. A week later, the Mercedes team moved across to Pescara, and again Caracciola won, with Farina in an Alfa in second place. Seaman was in pole position when Mercedes ran 4 cars at Bern in the Swiss Grand Prix. Seaman led the race in the wet for 10 laps, and then Caracciola proved that he'd lost none of his skill as the rainmaster. Seaman wisely held second place on his first drive since the ring and finished just 26 seconds behind Caracciola. Early in 1938, Hitler had annexed Austria, and the Grossglockner hill climb, alone in Austria on the map, became the major event in the German Hill Climb Championship. It was on the 28th of August, but the weather was poor and got worse. Two large 1937 Grand Prix Mercedes had been specially prepared for Lang and von Brauchitsch. But it was Stuck in a 6-litre Auto Union who won both heats, both in the dry and in the damp. The incredibly thorough Mercedes team were early at Monza, testing for the Italian Grand Prix. Uhlenhaut was proving a fine driver in his own right, but too valuable to risk racing. He was, however, a huge advantage as a test driver. The Italian Grand Prix was another disaster for Mercedes, and another win for Neubauer and Auto Union. The last great race of the year was in England and had been scheduled for October the 1st and then cancelled. But after the Munich agreement of the 30th of September, the Donington Grand Prix was reinstated. Uhlenhaut was again testing. 4 Mercedes and 4 Auto Unions faced 2 French Delahaye's, 1 Maserati, and an assortment of privately owned British cars. Dick Seaman was chosen to escort His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent. Hunlein had disguised himself as an English gentleman. The race was an awe-inspiring demonstration of German engineering. The British cars were driven with great courage, but were pathetically inadequate and were lapped time after time. There was drama when oil was spilled on the track, but Neubauer was almost the only one not to be affected. Acid crashed badly and was out. seaman lost a lap and a place. It was Nuvolari's day, and although he lost his lead at one point, he raced back through the field to score one of his finest victories. In 1939, the German economy was on a war footing, with absolute priority given to vital war production. All private car production was severely limited. War had been postponed by the Munich Agreement, and Hitler made full use of the extra time. Dr. Kissel, the chairman of Daimler-Benz, proclaimed that the factories are fully occupied with army and state orders. Surprisingly, in a Daimler-Benz film of the time, we find that the racing department was kept busier than ever. Nazi officials considered it as effective to spend money on motor racing as on guns and tanks. New Mercedes with improved aerodynamics were being developed to battle with Auto Union for the glory of the Third Reich. 19 of the 1938 engines were still serviceable, but new engines were needed for 1939, with comprehensive redesign and more emphasis on improving reliability. There was a vast engine testing program with 220 men working in the experimental department. Two-stage superchargers had already proved more efficient and could produce more power than the 1938 single-stage blowers. But more work was needed before the new engines would be ready for racing. In spite of all the military pressure, Hitler was out to prove that German automobile engineering was supreme, and time and money was found to fit one of the latest engines in a specially built car to break speed records. The Nazi chief of motorsport, Korpsführer Adolf Hühnlein, had stated that he wanted a German car that was the fastest on land, and with a German driver to take the record on German soil. Mercedes had already taken class records for large cars on the Frankfurt-Darmstadt motorway, and in 1939, another motorway near Leipzig was widened and specially prepared for higher speeds and further record breaking. British cars and drivers had dominated the land speed record for many years, and John Cobb and George Easton had recently driven at over 350 miles an hour in America, but that was on soft flats. In 1938, Caracciola had already driven at over 270 miles an hour on a German motorway, which was the highest speed recorded on any public road. Although Lang had done earlier testing, Caracciola insisted on driving, and that he was still the #1 Mercedes driver. Caracciola reached nearly 250 miles an hour with the 3-liter engine, and kept his place in the record books as the fastest ever driver on a public road. Class records were shattered, and work went ahead on a land speed record car with a Mercedes aero engine that was to be the great attraction of a German speed week in 1940. But sadly, that was to become one of the great might-have-beens of history. The Italian Empire in North Africa was the exotic setting for the first major Grand Prix of 1939. An Italian state lottery made the Tripoli Grand Prix one of the richest races in the world, the Corsa dei Milioni, the race of millions. For 4 years, German cars had dominated the event. But this year, the Italians moved the goalposts and excluded the 3-litre Mercedes by limiting the engine size to 1.5 litres, the engine size of many Italian racing cars. But astonishingly, in complete secrecy, Mercedes had produced 2 mini Mercedes, the W165. Before Marshal Balbo's flag had fallen, the Mercedes had taken the lead, and they led the field from start to finish. The 28 Italian Alfa Romeos and Maseratis were all left struggling behind. These lovely little Mercedes never raced again, but in their first and only race, they dominated the field. Lang led from the start, and when Caracciola took second place after 5 laps, the race was virtually over. Lang was less than 5 miles an hour slower than in the bigger car in the previous year. It was an astonishing triumph in every way. The first major German race for the new W154s was the Eiffel Grand Prix on the Nürburgring on the 21st of May. This was the first of the year's titanic battles between Mercedes and Auto Union. At the start, Nuvolari and Lang were on the front row. Lang was now on top of his form, and in spite of a tyre change, went on to beat Nuvolari by 11 seconds. There were 4 special Mercedes for the Kallenberg hill climb, and Auto Union were strong competitors with a new rising star, Hermann Muller. Muller won the first heat, but again Lang pulled it off and won by less than a second on overall times. The Belgian Grand Prix was on the very fast Spa circuit. Nuvolari and Caracciola both went off the road in torrential rain. Seaman, driving brilliantly, was in the lead, with Lang 28 seconds behind, when he crashed and subsequently lost his life. It was a joyless win for Lang, who scored his 5th Mercedes Grand Prix win of the season. The last German Grand Prix before the war was one of the toughest and most exciting. Even the changeable weather added to the drama. And the Graf Zeppelin was overhead to help the film crews. With 3 cars on the front grid, it promised to be another great Mercedes victory. But Auto Union had 5 cars and were well up and almost as fast. Lang blasted away at the start and finished his first lap leading by 27 seconds. But there was an Italian Maserati among the leaders, driven by Brauchitsch. And to the horror of the German crowd, when Lang pulled in for a plug change, it was the Italian Maserati that took the lead. The weather was treacherous, with wet and dry conditions which were upsetting engines as well as drivers. For a time, Neubauer took the lead, but this was one of Caracciola's great days. Many thought Caracciola had had his day, but he was in his element, and his 20th lap was the fastest of the race. And he went on to win, with Müller only a minute behind, after over 4 hours. Only 2 German cars finished out of the 9 that started. Caracciola had won his last and 6th German Grand Prix. The Nazi Sports Organization arranged for the 1939 German Hill Climb Championship to be decided on the Grossglockner Pass in the Austrian Tyrol on the 6th of August. Hitler had invaded Austria in 1938, and this comparatively unimportant motoring event had once again been given special significance to emphasize that Austria was now part of a greater Germany. No expense was spared, and the event was given the full film treatment. And 4 Mercedes had been specially prepared for Lang and von Brauchitsch. They were up against von Stuck and Müller. But there is little film of the auto unions, for this is, after all, a Mercedes film. Lang and von Brauchitsch had the choice of the big 1937 cars or the later 3 liters, and they both chose the bigger cars. The drivers were offered twin rear wheels, but both decided the road was too narrow and the corners too sharp. The Mercedes had been modified to save the weight of a water-filled radiator on the front wheels. Behind each driver was a radiator filled with glycol, and a carefully calculated quantity of water was boiled away. The steam can be seen as the engines are cooled. Lang was on the top of his form, But astonishingly, his first climb was a whole second slower than Müller in the Auto Union. Brauchitsch followed the reigning champion, Stuck, who had been half a second slower than Lang on the 8-mile-long course. It was a brilliant and courageous demonstration by all. Brauchitsch drove with all his usual flair, but was 18 seconds slower than the reigning champion, Stuck. Then it began to rain, and the mist rolled down the mountains as the cars came down for the second run. The conditions got worse and worse up the mountain. This was Lang's year, and he proved his skill and courage by beating Stuck by nearly 4 seconds under appalling conditions. For the first time for years, Stuck lost the German hill climb championship, and it went to Lang. The last race for the Silver Arrows was on the streets of Belgrade in Yugoslavia. Only a few days ago, Poland had been invaded, and in less than 2 years' time, German tanks will be rumbling along these streets, and thousands of Yugoslavs will be murdered in cold blood by the Nazis. The Mercedes and Auto Union teams were already in Belgrade, and although war was imminent, Hünlein had ordered the Germans to stay on and race. Hünlein wanted the race to be a frightening demonstration of German expertise. And the only opposition came from a slow, solitary Bugatti. Von Brauchitsch had been fastest in practice and took the lead from the start, with Lang close behind. Von Brauchitsch drove brilliantly on this slippery, cobbled circuit. For a time, Lang closed up, but had to retire with glass in his eye after a stone from Von Brauchitsch shattered his goggles. This was to be Von Brauchitsch's great chance, but he overdid it and spun. The Auto Unions then took over. For a time, it looked like a certain Auto Union victory, but tires punctured, and a quick pit stop put Von Brauchitsch back within seconds of Neubauer. This was not exactly what Hünlein wanted. The last race of the Silver Arrows was a German victory, but the winner was a small, lively Italian, Tazio Nuvolari, one of the greatest drivers of all time. '39 had been a Mercedes year. They had won 6 of the 8 Grand Prix races, and a last wartime celebration marked the end of a great period of motor racing. In 1939, a Heinkel fighter was fitted with a Daimler-Benz 601 aircraft engine and attained a first absolute speed record for Germany. A month later, a similar DB601 engine was used to take the record up to 469 miles an hour, which remained unbeaten for 30 years. DB601 engines were fitted to thousands of Messerschmitt fighters. Much of the wartime history of Daimler-Benz is still hidden, and not relevant to motor racing. But the works at Untertürkheim, where the racing cars had been built and developed, became the center for the development of the DB601 engines. These engines played a major part in the war, and Daimler-Benz had factories scattered over Germany and Eastern Europe, where tens of thousands of men and women, including foreign slave workers, were thrown on a massive scale into the battle to produce aero engines for the Luftwaffe and for tanks. Untertürkheim, with its highly skilled staff working on research and development, became a prime target for the Royal Air Force.